Well, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second evening of Walking Together. And if you were here last week, you had a chance to see a wonderful session with Cheryl Bear and an interview with her. And we're glad that you are here tonight for session number 2. We're hosting these presentations virtually from Canada near Ottawa, Ontario. And I would like to begin our time together by acknowledging that the land on which we are virtually presenting from is the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. We offer our gratitude for their care of and their teaching about our earth and our relations. And we pray that this evening's presentation will honor these teachings. So welcome back if you were able to attend last week, and if you are visiting for the first time, thank you for joining us. Good evening, unless you're on the West Coast, and good afternoon. And for a few people who registered from overseas, good morning. Yeah, we're so glad that you're here to be with us. And it's my privilege to reintroduce our 2 hosts for the evening, Sarah Beardy and Jonathan Merkel. Sarah lives in Peterborough and is the mother of 5 children, daughter of Levi and Vioji Cree heritage. She is of the Wolf Clan and has descended from her family's traditional lands, which include Bearskin Lake, Big Trout Lake, and parts of Newfoundland. Sarah and her family are members of the Selwyn Outreach Center in Peterborough. Welcome back, Sarah. And Jonathan is Mohawk from Ontario, residing on Tyendinaga Mohawk Nation territory with his wife Linda and 4 children. He founded Broken Wall First Nations musical group and ministry. Jonathan and his group have traveled the world for 25 years already, and they continue to seek to see people from cultural minorities restored and to be able to walk in their Christian destiny as full partners. And welcome back, Jonathan.
Good to be here with you all.
And you know, the theme of our whole 5 series is Walking Together. We are all treaty people, and I was just reminded today that next week here in Ontario is officially recognized as Treaty Week. And I'm an educator, and just today a lot of resources came in that are just incredibly rich in terms of a learning perspective, and they really fit well with the theme of this conference. So hopefully you in the audience don't mind, but we may send you a message with some of those really rich resources sometime during the next week or so. And also one other message for you in the audience. We can see a list of your names, but we know you cannot see each names just because of the style of this particular webinar. But something pretty beautiful and organic happened last week, and we are just going to encourage you to try that this week too. Last week, we had people in the audience use the Q&A feature as almost a little chat pod. And it may appear, the Q&A little button might appear at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, but you can use it twice tonight. If you want to post your name and where you're from, and if you know it, you can even tell us what Indigenous territory your community is part of. And if you need to look that up, a beautiful website for that is nativeland.ca. And between native and land, there's a little hyphen, native-land.ca. And then later in the evening, absolutely, positively, please post some questions as you think of them, based on the wonderful interview that's coming up between Sarah and Jonathan and Dr. Corbiere. So I'm going to turn this over to Sarah and Jonathan. And maybe, Sarah, we can start with you and you can give us a little overview of where we are so far in the series.
Great. Yeah, last week was awesome. It was a great start. We had Dr. Cheryl Bear. She gave her presentation called Indigenous Values, Identity, and Land. So she had talked about the relationship Indigenous peoples have with the land and how that relationship is critical, is a critical part of who they are and how they live. She did a really great job, I feel, in really setting the theme for the conference, that we are all treaty people.
So treaties are a foundational part of Canadian society. Every road, every house, building, or business that exists today in any treaty area was made possible because of a treaty. The fact that treaties exist at all is plain evidence that the first settlers respected Canada's Indigenous inhabitants as sovereign peoples and negotiated with them on a nation-to-nation basis. Many of us were taught that treaty rights were special Indigenous rights, but in fact, all people living in Canada are treaty people with their own set of rights and responsibilities. In this evening's session of our Walking Together series, we'll take a look at our shared history, wampum belts. Our hope as the hosts of this series is that by better understanding the authentic colonial history of Canada, we will be able to renew our relationships with one another and move towards meaningful reconciliation. We have entitled Alan's presentation as Canada's Real Creation Story.
You could almost say that you could call it like the things you never learned in school. Things that could have taught us how to live well together in the land we now call Canada. The 45th call to action proposed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 reads it this way. We call upon the Government of Canada on behalf of all Canadians to jointly develop with Aboriginal peoples a royal proclamation of reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. The proclamation would build upon the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara of 1764 and reaffirm the nation-to-nation relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown. Overall, this is a good goal. The trouble is, it's going to be hard to do. Nobody knows what the commissioners were talking about. Canadians have not only forgotten the promises that were set out in these agreements, they essentially never knew these agreements existed. It's tough to introduce a new royal proclamation when there's not many people who knew that there was an old one, like the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. But our goal is for Alan to help with this tonight. We need to get to work on this call to action. Canada needs a royal proclamation of reconciliation, and we have to improve this relationship.
A verse from the Old Testament has guided the development of our Walking Together series. In Jeremiah 6:16, we read, "Stand at the crossroads and look, ask for the ancient paths, ask where the good way is and walk into it, and you will find rest for your souls." Jeremiah 6:16. Our presenter this evening, Professor Alan Corbiere, has spent his lifetime studying ancient pathways, poring over crucial documents that were purposely buried long ago, pondering over the meaning of ancient wampum belts, working to recover the memory of crucial promises that were made, promises that are integral, essential to our walking together in right relationship today. There was an ancient pathway right here in Canada. a way of walking together that was good. But the weeds grew up, and the bushes and the trees, and the pathway became lost to mind. Before we invite Alan to join us, I have a song I'd like to sing for you that I wrote not too long ago that will be the title of the new album I'm writing. And this song is called The Call of the Drum. So many people in a hopeless place battle bitter feelings of a people displaced. They're living in the shadows of broken promises. They've stopped trying to pick up the pieces. There is a way back to who you were meant to be. When you look into the mirror, here's what you should see. Through the eyes of your Creator, for it is He who's calling you back to who you were meant to be. Hear the call of the drum, so sacred to the people. Hear the singers cry out, calling you home. Come and dance to the sound of freedom. Come and dance, and let's be one. Oh, hear the call of the drum. It's a call to honor. Come and dance to promises fulfilled. As we cry out, we're calling for justice, where honor, love, and life are restored. Many years you wandered aimlessly, lost and forgotten, was never meant to be. The gifts within you that you've never seen, they are waiting for release. They are waiting to be free. Hear the call of the drum, so sacred to the people. Hear the singers cry out, calling you home. Come and dance to the sound of freedom. Come and dance, and let's be one. Oh, hear the call of the drum. It's a call to honor. Come and dance to promises fulfilled. As we cry out, we're calling for justice, where honor, love, and life are restored. Oh, when I when I when I oh, when I when I when I oh, when I when I when I oh, when I when I when I
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Alan. Alan is an Anishinaabe from Chiking First Nation on Manitoulin Island. growing up there and later attending the University of Toronto for a Bachelor of Science. From there, he went to study at York University, earning his Master's of Environmental Studies. Alan has studied the Ojibwe language for many years and has attained some measure of fluency. For 5 years, he served as the executive director at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation in Chiging, a role which also encompassed acting as curator and historian. Alan has been the coordinator of the Anishinaabeg Revitalization Program at Chiging First Nation for language and cultural revitalization, for which work he was awarded the Governor General of Canada's Meritorious Service Medal. He is also the author and editor of multiple books and articles on Anishinaabe history and culture. In 2019, Alan earned his PhD focusing on Anishinaabe treaty making in the 18th and 19th century. Recently, he began a professorship at York University. Alan, we are glad you are here with us.
So, Alan, I'd like to start the whole thing out with the first question, and that is, you weren't always a history professor, were you? How did you ever get started on this journey, and how did you know where to dig, and what gave you the heart to keep going deeper and deeper?
Ngakke Nishnabem dash nin so jik mampim chiging don jaba chiging jinka de manda shkunagan niruminising te wishkunagan chija jago gi jinka de gaba odawa minis minwa dash manda shkunagan chija jago gi jinka de gaba michigwedno. Myself, I had to start by speaking the little bit of Ojibwe that I picked up. And I said, my name is Ojik in our language, and that means the fisher. And that's actually not an angler, it's actually an animal related in the weasel family. This animal is one that hunts porcupines and other small game, but also climbs trees and is a very quick animal. And my clan is the Bine, which is a rough grouse. That's the some people call them partridge around here, but I had heard enough jokes about being partridge family, so I didn't really say partridge. But we're a Bine clan, and the reserve I'm from is Michiging, and that means the on the spear. That's an old word for, they used to make a spear out of an antler tine, and that's what that name means. And there's a whole story that goes with it. We say here, our great uncle, Nanabojo, Gib me jibapto mampim chiging. Gib gijwe banan in the way, chigo on the way de, michigwednong. When Nanabush ran through this area, he ended up dropping his spearhead, and as well as the spear handle, and he dropped it at what is now called in English the cup and saucer, but that was called Michigwednong. In our, that's called Michigwednong bluff in the shape of a spearhead. That's what our name means in Ojibwe. I grew up here I was actually born in Toronto, and the first 5 years of my life I was living in Toronto, and then my parents didn't want to raise us down there, so they said we'll move back up to Chiging. And so I moved up here when I was 5 years old and started elementary school, and then went all the way through the high school, grade 13 back then, and then moved back to Toronto. But as a child, every day my parents my parents spoke Ojibwe to each other every day. Minwa dasha bapa ngi nishnabem toane osan minwa gashwan. My dad, he would speak to my grandparents and his siblings as well. But when he he and my mom spoke to my siblings and I. They spoke in English. So I grew up, I heard it, but I didn't pick it up. And only when I had a child, I met my wife in Toronto at the University of Toronto. And then once we conceived our first child, that's when I decided I should learn to speak my language. And I did my best to try and do that. And one of the ways to do it, I got my mom to name my eldest child. Then my dad named my second child, and then also my third child. So it was our kids. Our kids were all have Ojibwe names. They don't have any English names, but they don't. I wasn't fast enough in picking up Ojibwe, so I wasn't able to teach them that. And so I grew up here not speaking Ojibwe, and then I never had an interest in history really. Growing up, I grew up. I wanted to actually play hockey and like any other kid on the res, and or play music like Jonathan here. But I actually did neither of those. And what ended up happening was when my eldest was born, that's when I wanted to learn to speak Ojibwe. And so I started trying to learn. And after a while, I knew about 300 words, but I couldn't put them together. And that's when I met a friend of mine who said, take Marianne Corbiere's course at Laurentian. And actually, she shows you how to do that. And it was basically my frustration with learning individual words without putting them together that actually I said, I want to learn. I'm not here to just learn how to say, pass the sugar and pass the salt at dinner time. I actually want to learn how was our stories told and and I wanted to learn them in the original medium. And so that's when I started asking elders and looking at different sources of written Ojibwe that was already published. And so when I was back in school in Toronto, I found different books that were published. And then in those books, there was one called Ojibwe Text Anthology. They had quite a bit of stories about history. There was a woman named Alice King that they had talked to, and she talked about her grandfather had a medal, and that medal had been given to her grandfather at a treaty, she said, at the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty. So I was interested in that story and others as well. But I came home and I started saying, well, I'm just going to try and learn whatever stories the elders have here. So I went to visit one old man here named Johnny Debosque. And this Johnny Debosque was a World War II veteran, and his father was named Joe P. Debosque, and he was known in Ojibwe as Oga, and that means pickerel. And Oga in our language means pickerel, but you may know it as Oka. That's the same name in Quebec, that place name. Anyway, Oga was a chief here for many years. So I got to record Johnny. I asked him, Ani Shediming Chiging, what does Chiging mean? And then that's how he answered, was saying, well, this is, the story is, they used to talk about Nanabush. And then he told me the story of Nanabush. And then he told me the story of his ancestor, Debosque, coming here to, that he was a chief in Wiki at first. And then he came to Chiging, and he started Chiging, and then he gathered all the rest of his band. But in that story, he said that Chief Debosque, his ancestor, Gi Bimskoshka Mandamanis, he says, this Debosque walked all around the island. So some would say Giotashka. He walked all around this island and then came back. Then that's when he said, I think I found a place where we can make a living. And he said, Gin Kwashka Bejik Anishinaabe Makademin, Gijin Kazo Anishinaabe, that he met an Anishinaabe named Makademin. And that fella told him, well, if you go 30 miles or so west of here, you'll find a deep bay. And then if you walk in from that deep bay, you'll find another lake. And people there, if they settled there, they could make a living. That's what this Johnny DeBosque told me. And so his ancestor uh, decided to move his band here, and people started settling here in 1847 as a year-round settlement, I should specify. Anyway, I was just recording elders and writing out their stories. And then the tribal council here had an archive. And so me and my buddy, Terry DeBosque and Sam DeBosque, we went to the tribal council archives, and they were still working on what's called the islands land claim, the islands claim here. And they had all these files there. So at that time, there was one bound, big oversized bound folio, and this folio had these handwritten documents in there. And so I'm looking through that, and then I started seeing clan signatures by petitions and treaties. And then so I kind of got interested in, okay, well, trying to find where's the Corbiere clan. Anyway, I found the DeBosque clan and other clans in those documents, and I started compiling it for Chiging, but also other area bands. And then what really surprised me then was I actually found documents written in Ojibwe by our chiefs. So this was in the the earliest one I found was 1829, but 1830s and 40s, the Anishinaabe chiefs here of Nidominising, they used to write in Ojibwe. Gi Anishinaabe ge wakagundak gimabenik mampi Nidominising. So they used to write in Ojibwe, and we were taught that by the priests. So that's when I started, I converted how they write, because they would write a different style than we write today. And so I would write that out and convert it to what we call now the double vowel orthography or the Fierro orthography. But back then they were writing in a French-inspired orthography used by the Jesuits, and the Jesuits were stationed here at Holy Cross Mission in Manitoulin. So that's where I found a letter written in Ojibwe, and there was a gathering here in Chiging at that time as well. So I started collecting documents written in Ojibwe, and I started collecting documents that were signed with clans. And it was really out of the desire to learn to speak Ojibwe, but then that desire to learn to speak Ojibwe actually led to a desire to tell our story in its original medium and our perspective on history in its original medium, meaning Anishinaabe. So back to Johnny DeBosque and the archives. So Johnny DeBosque told me that story, that his ancestor walked this whole island and that he was a chief in Wiki. And in those archives, the folio that I had written, here the Indian agent had written down in 1847, Chief DeBosque has left here at Wikwemikong. He was one of the Ojibwe chief here at Wikwemikong, and he has found a place at Michigwedinong, and he hopes to settle there with the rest of his band. And he has to summon his band from the mainland to all come back and be under his leadership. And the Indian agent further stipulated, he said, I told him that that isn't the government's plan. That the Ojibwe who accepted Roman Catholicism are to live on the West End. The Catholics are supposed to live on the East End of the island, and the Protestants or Anglicans live on the West End. And then the further West End were for what they called at that time the pagans. So the ones that didn't accept any Christianity. So my mother's people, my grandfather, that's what he was, one of those so-called pagans. Mabadasha namishom saba Moses shage gijin kaza gi makadeke pi shkinwet. So that's what Johnny DeBosque also told me about my mother's people. He says, "Gaigi dapnazinwe when to go when they didn't take what in our language we say French religion, meaning Catholicism." He says, "Gim kadekewak," they fast for their knowledge. Kim kare kewak win dakendamawat gego. They fast to know something. So that's who my mother's people were at the west end of Manitoulin. Anyway, what I ended up finding was that the stories Johnny Debosky was telling me from the oral tradition, I was finding in the archival records as well, and this was really something that triggered something in me, and I wanted to learn more. So.
Like that emphasis on language and Anishinaabe Moan being such an important to understand how to communicate two parties, like to have that language is just so important. And I really took from that when you say I didn't want to learn how to pass the salt. I wanted to understand what was being written. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. But also, I know a lot of people are going to be interested and have questions on your studies. And just to kind of reiterate what Jim had said, we are taking questions through the question and answer option on the screen. So feel free to put those in, and we'll get to them as they come up a little later in the presentation. But also, could you begin by telling us how early Indigenous peoples kept records of important events and interactions?
So I talked a bit there about one of the ways, and that's just the oral tradition. And the other way, I used to go act as what we call a Oshka Bewis. And Oshka Bewis is a helper, ceremonial helper. But I used to help this old man. I wasn't the only one. There was many of us. And this old man was very learned. And one of the major things I learned from him, one day, when I was doing my undergrad at University of Toronto, I'd bring him to University of Toronto to come and talk. And one day he brought out this, he finished up his presentation. And then I started cleaning up because I was part of the cleanup crew as well. And so everyone was leaving, and then we started wiping down, putting dishes away and stuff like that. And then that old man put out a map on the coffee table. And then he says to me, "Alan, you better come here." So of course, when the elder tells you to come, you go there. So I went and sat down, and here what it was a map of the Peterborough petroglyphs, what they call Kinamalgeoapkong and Kinamalgeoabik. So Kinamalge means to teach, and Abik means rocks. So they call that teaching rocks. Anyway, so we weighed it down because it was rolled up. So we weighed it down on that paper. And then he just started pointing and just started talking. He says, "This is what this means. This is what that means. And then here's where you look. This one makes you look over there, and that's what you see is happening now." And he says, "You read this, read all this, and make sense of it, what's going on now." So that is one way that the Anishinaabe passed on knowledge, was that Kinamalgeoapkong, what they call now petroglyphs, and that's north of where you are, Sarah, I believe. I don't know if you've ever been there. Yeah. So, and it's just massive, the amount of petroglyphs that are in there. Anyway, this one of the things that I learned, that was the major thing, one of the major things that made me realize the depth and the scope of what I missed out on, basically, as a kid. Because what this old man knew, there was so much that I wanted to learn. The other thing that I learned from him was I was there when he named I got him to name my nephew. And when he named my nephew in Ojibwe, he sang a song. And when he sang that song, then he said what the name was. And then I told my nephew, then this is what your name is. And then I asked him what it means. And then the old man told us what it means. So when we got that name, then he says, the old man says, well, now you got to learn what that song is. That's what he told my nephew. He got to learn that song. And then in that song contains the teachings of what that name means and what that song means. So when I go talk to our young people, when I hear them gathered, and they invite me, sometimes once in a while I get invited to go and do a talk. I tell them, I ask them, any of you have your Anishinaabe names? And so now, when I first started out and I asked that, not many had their names. But now there's more getting their Anishinaabe names. And then I say to them, okay, now if you have that, if we are trying to save our language, imagine that each one of you had a name in Ojibwe, and each of you had a different name. Then if there were 50 of us in this room, then that means we have 50 words. I said, but imagine if all of you knew the song that goes with that name and the words in those songs, then we would have even more of those words and that understanding. And then when you have that song actually refers to what people would call the grand narrative or your big narrative, and where you fit in there with that name. And so that's what we would then be able to piece that together. So I look at it as kind of a big puzzle. And I often refer to these this book that I read, and many people have heard of it, called the Mishomis book. And in one of the prophecies there that Badwewadam talks about, he mentions that there will come a new people, and these young people will look for what was left along the trail. And when they look for that, what is left along the trail, they'll pick it back up and try to make it useful again to today's society. And he doesn't just mean stuff that was taken and put into museums or private collections. He actually also means the songs that are that people carry, and the names that people carry, and the stories that people carry, and then how this all fits together. Because our Anishinaabe people have, as you know, through colonization, have actually that was greatly discouraged our worldview. And so a lot of it had to go underground. But when it went underground, it also just a few people were the ones that kept it. But they weren't able to keep, not one person knows everything, basically. And the more that people that you bring together that can share bits, then you bring those bits all back together and you can reconstitute that. And that's what I've been trying to get young people to think about when they ask for their Anishinaabe names, especially the names that actually have a song that go with it. And then that song fits in with what we call the grand narrative, or our story, the Anishinaabe story. And that fits in part of it. So for instance, my name is Ojik, and that means the fisher. And one of the things that I looked in my ancestors on my mother's side, there was a person, a woman named Ojik Anang. And in our language, Ojik Anang actually means the Big Dipper, that constellation. And so here's what happens when you don't keep your language and your stories intact. I've started to see curriculum developed in schools, and they'll say, for the Big Dipper in Ojibwe, they'll say Kchik Guabagan. And Kchik Guabagan actually means Guabagay, you're scooping. And that Guabagan, when I was a kid, we had no running water here in Chiging. And so we had to go to my grandparents had a well, and then we'd have to haul water to our house. and then we'd have to have a dipper in that water, and we would drink right from the water, the pail. So we would use that. That's so that actually, when you don't know the story of a Jikanung, that's a legend. You end up replacing that constellation, the story of that constellation, with an English understanding, and then that's when our knowledge gets supplanted by Western society's knowledge. And that's what we're trying to peel back. And what I believe Badwayo was talking about, when you pick something up that was left along the trail, then you start to bring that back and breathe life into it. And that's what we say. Many of you would have heard the recreation story after the flood, when the muskrat brings back a bit of that earth. And then our great uncle breathes on that those grains of sand to create the new world. So for us, in a sense, with that knowledge, we breathe life back into that for ourselves, and we're reconstituting Anishinaabe Madzuan, Anishinaabe life. That's what we're trying to do with that. So that's why this language is so important, but also our names, and then our history, and those place names that I was talking about. Why I asked that old man, what does Chiging mean? What is that? The name of that? And then what I always tell people is, the important part of that story is he didn't just say, oh, it means the place in the shape of the bluff in the shape of a spearhead. His answer actually is the first line when he answered that question was, the long time ago, they used to talk about Nanabush. That's how he answered that question. And so that's how we transmit our knowledge, through those names, through those songs, through those images, and through our language. So put another way, when I was at the University of Toronto, it was a good time to be there, because they used to bring in a lot of elders from different nations. And one of the elders I used to like listening to, I haven't had much time to listen to him lately, is Bruce Elijah, who is a Oneida fellow. But he used to say that if you have these four things, you'll be a complete person, and that's a name, a song, a clan, and land, your land. If you know those four, then you and the songs that go with those, and the knowledge that goes with those, then you'll be what we would call an educated person from our point of view, Anishinaabe point of view, or Onyadag point of view, the way he says Oneida. So the Ojibwe people, of course, are also famous for birch bark scrolls, and how they would code information inside birch bark with pictographs, and also cliff faces. They would paint those cliff faces with images as well. And one of the more famous spots is on Sault Ste. Marie, northwest of Sault Ste. Marie, place called Agawa Canyon Lake Superior Provincial Park. The other way also, of course, is pipes and wampum belts. So, and we could talk a bit more about those wampum belts and the images that are on there, because those wampum belts aren't just Haudenosaunee belts. When I first started talking about these wampum belts back in 2002, I had my friend, the late Emmerich Migwas. He had him make that belt, because we had an accurate description of it. This fella had met Jean-Baptiste Signac, and Jean-Baptiste Signac, back in the 1820s to the 1850s, he was one of the keepers of these belts. Anyway, he let this fella do a charcoal rubbing of that belt. And then he not only did he do a rubbing, he actually counted the number of beads on each strand of so we had an accurate description of these belts, and my friend remade those. So I started talking about those belts in 2002. And for a number of years afterward, people would always come up to me afterward and they say, what are you doing? That's a Mohawk thing. That's not an Anishinaabe thing. Anishinaabe never used wampum. But now nobody says that to me. It's just been years, not just me working, but a lot of people seeing the evidence, the historical evidence that was hidden from us, the evidence that we didn't grow up with, that was uncovered. And as figuratively said, we found it along the trail and we brought it back into our current life. And now a lot of people are looking to those wampum belts for answers as well. So that's some of the stuff that we Anishinaabe used to transmit information, and there's a lot of other ways as well, but those are the ones that I'm more familiar with.
That's really interesting. I like learning, and I just learned some interesting things because when you said learning about the belt and how people thought it was Mohawk or Haudenosaunee, and that's an interesting thing that since 2002 you've been studying it. So I have a question here for you. Tell us about the events that led up to the gathering at Fort Niagara in 1764.
Those so of course prior to that there's a lot of history that goes into it, but the French and the Anishinaabe, the majority of the Anishinaabe were allied with the French. And then the majority of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, were allied with the British. And so of course, they were fighting for supremacy in North America here. And then, of course, 1759 and 1760, there were significant battles, and the tide changed, and the French lost on the Plains of Abraham. And they ended up being victorious, but they were also told in no uncertain terms that our chief then at that time was named Minwewe, Chief Minwewe, and that's just part of his name. I guess his name was Minwewe Benesse, some said, but Minwewe, or it's been written by Alexander Henry the Elder, Minavavana, but there's no V's in our language. So there was a transcription error entered into the record at some point. Anyway, Chief Minwewe told Alexander Henry at that point, he says, Englishmen, you conquered the French, but you haven't conquered us. He says, we are not your slaves, and our ancestors left us these mountains, these rivers, and these animals. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. You have come up here to our area, and Alexander Henry had come up to Michilimackinac, and he says, you haven't brought us any presents, and you haven't entered into any treaty with us. He says, anytime we go to war and whoever spills our blood is still considered an enemy until they have actually brought us presents, or we have spilled their blood to satiate the spirits of the dead, of our dead. He says, since you have done neither, we are still at war, and your life is forfeit here. Fortunately for Alexander Henry, his one of the Anishinaabe adopted him. Anyway, so he lived to tell the tale. But it was for sure that the Anishinaabe actually were not conquered. We were not conquered by the Haudenosaunee, nor by the British, nor by the French. So the British started to act like they had won and defeated the Anishinaabe. And even afterwards, they came. They wanted to actually have peace. And so for a long time, the British and the French were playing off each other, but also the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe were playing the French off the British for cheaper goods and for trading partnerships. So there were wampum belts delivered for those trading relationships. But in 1761, Sir William Johnson, who was then at that point appointed the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for the Northern Superintendency, actually wanted to enter into the covenant chain with the Western Confederacy, the covenant chain had already been established between the Dutch and the Mohawk, and then subsequently the covenant chain was extended to the rest of the 5 nations at that particular time before the Tuscarora joined with the 6 nations. And then afterward, the covenant chain was actually extended between the British and the Haudenosaunee. But in 1761, the British wanted to actually have the Western Confederacy enter into that relation as well. So the Western Confederacy, the mainstays of the Western Confederacy are the Odawa, the Huron-Wendat, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, Munsee, Lenape, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Sauk, Fox, and many others that would come in and out of that. And so even the Cree were part of that in 1764. But in 1761, Sir William Johnson went to Detroit to actually enter into this covenant chain wampum belt and relationship. And that's when he extended it there and they accepted it. It was the Huron and the Odawa who were the principal leaders, speakers for the Western Confederacy at that time. But that peace didn't last, that covenant chain didn't last because the British, of course, after General Amherst started infecting blankets with smallpox and sending them out, and then also curbing the presents that were what our ancestors knew was due to them. So they used to deliver presents to our people. And these presents took the form of ammunition, ball, shot, guns, as well as sometimes cod lines, mackerel lines, net thread, as well as canvas for our lodges, canvas for sails on our canoes, and also coarse cloth for our leggings, our shirts, and for women's skirts. And then they also gave us a bunch of silver for our ears and nose, and also arms and bracelets. And then they also gave us blankets. So they gave us all kinds of things, and they gave us combs. Every year they gave us that. And that was a pledge for them to actually live in alliance with us. And some would say that was a form of rent. So they would give us that every year. And that was what General Amherst ended up cutting off. And then once he did that, and he started trying to act more what we now would say unilaterally. And this was when an Odawa chief named Pontiac, or now we say Pontiac, and a Seneca chief named Gayasota gathered together, and they decided that they were actually not going to accept that, and that they were going to push back. So that's when they decided that they were going to take some of the forts, and Pontiac was supposed to take Fort Detroit, and then he had actually asked Majiquis, who was another chief, but from Michilimackinac area, and they took Fort Michilimackinac. And then they took a number of the different forts in 1763, in the spring of 1763. And so prior to that, though, what was in the works was the Royal Proclamation. And that Royal Proclamation set out the terms of how land was going to be alienated from the indigenous people into the hands of the crown, and then the crown would then sell that. So that was how we were supposed to have this treaty relationship set up. So anyway, that ended up happening, that the General Amherst curbed the presence, and then he started acting unilaterally. And the Royal Proclamation actually was in formulation, but it actually hadn't been passed or implemented. And then in the spring of 1763, the Anishinaabeg took over Fort Michilimackinac, and then a number of other forts were taken. And Detroit, Pontiac led a siege on Fort Detroit, but he was never able to take it. And so in 1763, Sir William Johnson was then told that he would have to bring Pontiac in for peace. And one of the things that he recommended, Sir William Johnson wrote to the boards of trade as well as to his superior, General Gage, because by this time, after this war broke out, Amherst was returned to England. And then when he came, he wrote to Gage. He says, "I believe a treaty of an offensive and defensive alliance would best suit the purposes. And on that occasion, we should use the forms that they most readily recognize, meaning that an exchange of wampum should commemorate that agreement." And that's the wampum belt that you have hanging there behind you, that 1764 Covenant Chain wampum belt, yeah. So this was occurring. The Royal Proclamation, I believe it actually arrived in North America by December 1763. And then Sir William Johnson sent out runners, including some Nipissing and Algonquin people, and they ran through the country inviting people to a great council to be convened at Niagara. And when these runners went, it's reported in some sources that they actually carried a copy of the Royal Proclamation with them. And these Nipissing and Algonquin went village to village, inviting people to come down for the month of July. And so they thought, though, bear in mind that Pontiac hadn't surrendered, nor had Gayasota, and many different nations hadn't made peace yet. So they thought this might have been a ruse. They thought they were still at war. So anyway, they decided it's reported up in Sault Ste. Marie area that when they received those messengers, they said, we're not sure, and so we better ask for assistance in our decision making. So they said they would ask the spirit. And that's when they actually got who we call Jiskiwinene, and that's a shake tent operator. And so they put the question to him, and he said, will we be accepted as friend or foe? And then the spirit, the main interpreter of that spirit is the turtle, Mikanak. And that Mikanak come in, and he's really slow on land, but in the spirit world, he's really fast. Anyway, so what Mikanak was asked that question, he was given tobacco, and that Mikanak went, the spirit left that shake tent lodge, and then he came back. And he said, Sir William Johnson has his fires ready, and there will be a big feast for this to happen. And he says, and he'll give a lot of presents to the people, and he says, and he's got kegs of rum that even the stoutest Anishinaabe will not be able to lift on their own. You will be treated as friend. So then they asked another question. They said, how many red coats are there? How many soldiers are there? And so that turtle went off again. And then he came back, and he says, I went all along the shore of Lake Huron, and there weren't any red coats. And as I went along the shores of Lake Erie, there were more red coats. And I got to Niagara, there were some more. And I went along the shore of Lake Ontario, and there were increasing numbers of red coats. And as I ascended the St. Lawrence River and got to Montreal and Quebec, I saw that there were more red coats than there are leaves on the trees, and you will never be able to defeat them. So based on these instructions and these answers from the spirit, the chiefs in the Sault Ste. Marie area decided that they would go to Niagara. And one of the chiefs that went was named Togwagane. And That's who one of the chiefs' name was from this area. And then Nego Mane was an Odawa chief that went down as well from our area. Anyway, so they went down, and thousands of people entered that, went down there to participate in that treaty, and they met for a month. So the other interesting thing is that Sir William Johnson lived in the land of the Mohawks, and he actually had some would say a wife, some say a consort named Molly Brant. I was going to say Molly Johnson, but that's the blues singer. Anyway, Molly Brant, sister of Joseph Brant. And so she was his teacher. She taught William Johnson what to do. Anyway, when they had their gathering, it was at Fort Niagara. And the Anishinaabe, as they went, they still were suspicious even right up to that when they approached Niagara. They approached it from the west. And they actually decided that they would paint themselves up. And they painted themselves up ready for war or for peace. And then they ended up deciding that they would stay on the west side of the Niagara River, opposite the shore of Fort Niagara. And so that's where the Anishinaabe contingent stayed, on the opposite side of the river. But every day, Sir William, if you read his correspondence and his records of that time, he was meeting all kinds of people, all kinds of chiefs daily at times. And it sounds like he was just run ragged during that whole month, because he had people, delegations that were not Shawnee, sorry, Huron-Wendat, Ojibwe, Odawa, and even some what they call Tocomawans, which are Lake of the Woods, Rainy River area Ojibwe people. And he also had Cree people and Mississauga people. He had all these different kinds of people there. So the other thing that you got to bear in mind, especially when we're talking now, and when I'm trying to use as much Ojibwe as I can in this forum. But if you think back to then, how many interpreters he needed, because all these different languages that were coming to meet and to make peace and to tie their hands in friendship and to enter into the covenant chain treaty relationship with the British. So that's why I try to remind people by speaking Ojibwe that, back then and even up to maybe 100 years ago, non-native people in the Toronto area would have had somebody who spoke Ojibwe. Non-native people would have had an interpreter there, and they would have spoke our language as well and met us halfway. And so that's what leads me again to this other issue that I want to emphasize here while I got the time, is that I was listening years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I was at a conference, and it's called the Algonquin Conference. And this linguist named Chris Wolfhart, he's a professor out there. He did a paper on the treaty relationship and language. And he was actually asked to be an expert witness in a court case. Anyway, his presentation was looking at the treaty terminology in the actual treaty document. So he was saying, and this was to me really important, was that, at that time in Europe, if there's any treaty between two different nations in Europe, there are 3 copies made in 3 different languages. So if the Spaniards entered into a treaty with the Germans, there would be a German copy of the treaty, and there would be a Spanish version of the treaty. And then everyone in Europe at that time, the nation states, they all agreed that if there are any disputes between different treaties, they would refer to the French version. So that's why there's 3 versions of treaties in Europe at that time and in our treaty time. So what Chris Wolfhard said is, by the time they're doing treaties here, the Bible had already been translated. And he's talking about the prairies. And he says, and the priests sometimes were the interpreters, as well as sometimes fur traders. But of course, you don't want to generalize, but usually priests are more educated than the fur traders at that time. So he says, how come there isn't a Cree version of our treaty? And so this, when he said that, this stuck in my mind as well. How come there isn't an Ojibwe version of our treaty? Because we could write in Ojibwe by that time. And then the other thing that he had mentioned, Chris Wolfhard had mentioned, he says he read the diary of the priest at that time. And on the day of the treaty, the priest writes in his journal, I went down to the lake to gather my thoughts on how I'm going to translate this. Then he says, where's the translation? So his hypothesis is basically there should have been 2 copies of the treaty at that time, English version and Ojibwe version. So, and then the other thing that's interesting about 1764 was that Sir William Johnson said, I left them, the chiefs, and this wasn't Niagara, but at a different treaty, he says, we retired for the day, and I left a written copy of the document with the chiefs and their interpreter. So they talked, the chiefs and their interpreter had the document, and they talked about it overnight. So I know this is a Baptist. The Baptists are the one that invited me here to talk today. And up in our area, Sault Ste. Marie, there were Baptists, and one of them was named Abel Bingham. And he was around the Sault Ste. Marie area in the 1830s. He couldn't speak Ojibwe, but he tried to learn. But he had interpreters there. And then also, after a while, he was able to get enough facility that he produced what they call these primers, Ojibwe reading primers. So that's what I've been searching for in these archives are, well, okay, did anybody write anything about the treaty in Ojibwe? And so by the 1830s, there's more literacy, of course, but in the 1760s, there isn't. Fortunately, though, in our area, on Manitoulin specifically, our chiefs wrote in Ojibwe, and they wrote in 1862, right here on this reserve where I am, in Michiquednong in 1862, June 27, the chiefs of Manitoulin gathered together and they wrote down their understanding of that covenant chain that was entered into at Niagara in 1764. So to me, that a lot of people talk about the Royal Proclamation, and they'll call the Royal Proclamation the Indian Magna Carta. But to me, our Magna Carta is that wampum belt that's hanging behind Jonathan there. And our understanding for our purposes is that written Ojibwe document that was written on June 27, 1862, right here in Michiquednong.
Wow, so I'm just kind of picturing this as you're telling it. Yeah, and this great meeting of all of these nations coming to talk and gather for these. Yeah, no, sorry, I'm just a little bit. My mind is a little running as you go. Now I know that we have the 1764 wampum belt behind Jonathan, but there's also the 2-row wampum. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Personally, I don't talk about that one.
Okay.
And it's because from all the reading I've done, that's not an Anishinaabe belt.
Mhm.
So, but I see a lot of people now that it's got good concepts behind it and precepts. But to me, I feel like I don't have the right to talk about that because to me that's a Haudenosaunee belt, and I don't I don't profess to be Haudenosaunee.
That's fair. Jonathan, I'm just going to pass it over to you there. I believe you have.
I that's very interesting about the belt and the discoveries that you've made. Like, I'm just sitting here getting enlightened too, just like Sarah. I mean, she was kind of just enwrapped in that, thinking about it, because as you tell the story, it made me feel as though I was like stepping right into it. So I've just been taking notes. Another question that we have is, why was a treaty needed? The British had already defeated the French. They'd already proclaimed how they were going to run things in North America. Why didn't Indigenous people just accept it? Why two documents? How do they work together? What sort of promises were made?
So, like I guess I wasn't clear. General Amherst was curbing the presence, and to us that was a part of the condition of their being able to live here. And they had stated that that we own the land, and they said to the British that you may have conquered the French, but the French didn't buy the land from us,
Right.
and the French don't own this land. We own it. So the British, when they defeated the French, they started to act like they actually owned the land. And all they said at Niagara and at Detroit in 1761 was that they were allowed to actually take over the French posts, the outposts or the forts. And how they talked about that in our language, they would say that they were able to ignite a fire in our country. And that's a metaphor for lighting lighting a fire is a metaphor for taking over a fort. And then also establishing a council fire also means that they are permitted to stay there. And then when they have that council fire, that's where official business is going to be conducted. So after 1761, Sir William Johnson sends up people with belts later, and the speech. And one of the things that he doesn't get in trouble, but it's Colonel Bradstreet that gets in trouble later because he used the word subjects. That he tries to get the Seneca and the Mississaugas and the Shawnee to be accepted as subjects. So then one of the chiefs actually says that he will become a child of the British, and the British would become their father. So this is where things get tricky because we try to then look at how they talk about subjects. What they ended up doing, though, just to back up a bit, Sir William Johnson gave belts to the commanding officers who were then to go establish council fires up at Fort Augustus at the Green Bay area, and as well at Fort Michilimackinac. So they had two commanding officers go up with a regiment, and they had this speech. And then part of the speech was that we ignite a fire here, a council fire, and all the Indians from around the country will see its light and will come to feel its warmth. And when they come to feel its warmth, that is a metaphor for receiving clothing. And that's also receiving warmth is a metaphor for receiving the presence. And I talked about those presents that they would receive, which of course was the cloth for skirts, shirts, and loincloths, and then also the blankets, but also the net thread, cod lines, mackerel lines, and ammunition, gun, ball, and shot, as well as the rum. In our language, we say ishkodewabo, fire water. So that was what they said with this council fire when they established it at Green Bay, Detroit, Niagara, and Michilimackinac, that these particular council fires would burn eternally, that they would use the choice pieces of wood, and that fire would never go out. And again, the fire is symbolic, of course, of life, but also the life of an agreement. So that council fire was never to go out, and it was supposed to be ignited and fed. And they were actually told, Gishpin wiatek kadushkademowa, jichi kajeamok kadushkademowa. If you think your fire is going out, stoke it, they said, and I will wonder what is going on. And I'll wonder that my children must have something lacking, and I'll see what is lacking. I'll ask what is lacking and send it right away. And that's a reference to the presence as well. What should also be pointed out here is that this, I want to stress again, this wampum belt, when I said it's the Magna Carta, is because the Anishinaabe or Western Confederacy understanding of this belt is that we are the owners of this land. And what that belt recognizes in the way the chiefs understood it is that the British are affirming Aboriginal title, what is now called Aboriginal title. Now that's a legal concept that lawyers are getting paid to debate about. But in the eyes of the chiefs back then, that's what that belt represented, that the British are affirming that this is Anishinaabe land, Haudenosaunee land, Shawnee land, Huron-Wendat land, that they're the owners of that. So that's why I say that belt is the Magna Carta. Right. The other thing that I say about that is that they then promised you don't have the other belt that goes with that, and it's called the 24 Nations belt. And that 24 Nations belt has on the one end a rock, and that rock or mountain would be, some say, is the mountain at the rock at Quebec or the whole total island of North America. Anyway, on that white belt are images of 24 men holding hands. And then at the other extremity of the belt is a ship. So in that ship are all the presents that the British are giving to the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Cree, the Lakota, the Huron-Wendat, Sauk, Fox, Menominee, Miami, all these nations. Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet. So all these people, that's who made peace with the British and who would receive presents yearly. And that's what was the cost of them to come and live here, is that every year they'd give us that. And that's what that belt represents. And that second belt, the 24 Nations belt. So
when Colonel Bradstreet referred to Native people as subjects, did that set some sort of precedent at that time? Could you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Well, when the treaty was handed in and Sir William Johnson saw it, then he said, he wrote off a flurry of letters right away, and he said, this treaty is we should void it right away and not use that language, because they are a proud people and they don't consider themselves conquered. And if we start to use that language in the way they would use English back then, Sir William Johnson said it would just raise their jealousies and create suspicion. And they had just finished fighting a war. And they said, and one of course, what I failed to mention is that Sir William Johnson said to enter into delivering presents to them annually is far cheaper than fighting a protracted war with them. So he saw it as a way, and of course save lives as well. So he saw peace over war as basically the cheaper economic alternative as well. So he was fearful that if that treaty, the terms of that treaty got out, and that they saw that they were subjects, they would protest that, and they would then uh, uh, renew their resistance to that and break that. So that's what he was able to try and basically fix that. The other thing that should be noticed is the duplicity of Sir William Johnson, because in his correspondence he also said that we'll tell. He doesn't say this quite blunt as this, but he basically says we'll give them presents and say that it's forever, but we'll gradually diminish them to the point that we'll then discontinue them. And that's what happened in 1854. The presents were discontinued. So for 90 years, basically, the covenant chain was struck with the Western Confederacy in 1764. Presents were delivered, all kinds of presents were delivered at various forts and stations, namely Niagara in the early years and Detroit, and then it became Amherstburg, Fort Malden, Fort York, Kingston, and at Montreal, of course, Fort Michilimackinac, and then after the War of American Revolution, St. Joseph's Island and by Sault Ste. Marie, and then Drummond Island after the War of 1812, and then after 1836, Manitoulin Island was the council fire between the Western Confederacy and the British for the nations that had fought alongside the British around Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan area. And then others also continued down at Fort Amherstburg by Malden. So these presents were supposed to continue in perpetuity and not be diminished. But of course they were diminished and they were eventually discontinued. And it was the duplicity of Sir William Johnson. But the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee look at those agreements as being forever. As long as the grass grows, the sun crosses the sky, and the waters flow.
So the Treaty of 1764 of Niagara talks about sharing and living in a respectful nation-to-nation relationship. The wampum belt shows two people holding hands. But in respect to Treaty 9 in Ontario, which was written in 1905 and covers about 2/3 of Ontario's landmass, explicitly demands the extinction of Indigenous ownership of the land. It uses terms like cede, release, surrender, and yield up, which doesn't sound like the same thing as sharing. It makes you wonder what happened. How do we get from holding hands to cede, release, surrender, and yield? Any thoughts on that?
Those same terms are used in different treaties in this area as well. And the interesting thing is those are all legal concepts, but in Ojibwe, there's only basically one word, bigidnan, to release it or let it go. And the nuance of yield, surrender, and cede, all this is of course legal concepts that they did not properly explain to the chiefs at that time. And I didn't get to finish listening to this CBC, I think it was CBC podcast with the late John Long, and this fellow wrote a massive book on Treaty 9, and then they did this radio show about Treaty 9 and the issues surrounding it, and there's stuff on the translations, of course, as well. And incidentally, there's actually an exhibit at the Ontario Archives on Treaty 9 right now. I don't know if it's digital, but I know they were having an on-site one. So I myself, for that progression, like what I hinted at, the skeptic in me, and I guess the realist in me, sees that that was the plan all along, to quiet the people enough so that they would then be able to take everything. And then Canada always considers itself less brutal than it was less brutal than the Spaniards, and then less brutal than and then it became less brutal than the Americans. So they all often think of themselves as Canada often thinks of themselves as not as ruthless as the States, but the results can be the same. The swindles, mass scale swindles, of course, and then the resultant social problems and economic disparities throughout Anishinaabe King are the result of that grand plan throughout. And a part of it, of course, what a lot of people would say, skeptics would say of that is, we never had a big master plan that for 100 years from now we would dispossess everybody, dispossess all the indigenous people of that. And that some would say it's just the result of capitalism, but also this Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest, or within a capitalist regime. Those are issues that of course are prevalent here, and that we've actually not been able to get our fair share, even in the Robinson Huron Treaty area. In 2017, we just won a significant court case, and for the annuities to have increased, and our chiefs at that time actually inserted a clause in there that the annuity would increase as as the government realized the profit. And it only increased once in 1874 from $1 to $4. So it's still currently per capita $4. But of course, in that interim time, throughout that time, the government took specific measures to actually reduce the amount of eligible people who would receive that annuity. And so they would say any so-called, excuse my language, but half-breeds would be ineligible. And any women marrying non-treaty Native people would lose their annuity. And then any Native woman marrying a non-Native man would also lose their annuity, and the kids wouldn't be entitled to it. So that's how they were parsing this all out and getting rid of a lot of people that they had to pay. So the same kind of process, that this is 1850, and by the time they got to 1905, they had a lot more experience on how they were going to do this. That's the skeptic in me, and I would say the realist in me. Look how he looks at it and analyzes that.
We have a lot of people who are listening, and I really think that you're enlightening a lot of people with how you're sharing the clarity of the history, because a lot of people don't understand this. You know, when I think about it, like the records that you're describing and the things that you're talking about are actually the founding documents of this country. The founding documents, like when this country was organized and formed, these were the documents that they adhered to, that they had to adhere to because they needed us at the time.
Yeah.
So basically, what I have here is that you're presenting us with Canada's birth narrative, Canada's creation story that people don't even know about. I mean, when you go to school, you don't learn any of the stuff that you're teaching, like that you're sharing with us. What we've learned is what they wanted us to learn, so they could continue to disseminate and break it all down, so that we would be welcomed into the mass of multiculturalism rather than being the founding people of this land or the original inhabitants of this land. So how come we never heard this before? Like if
Well, that's part of the design too, eh? I think that uh, it's a way to dispossess us of our land, but also the resources therein, and also of our dignity. And then it also has to be recognized that the role various denominations of churches played in that as well. And then we would actually look at uh, how to turn this around is going to take a long time as well. But you, when I went to school, I never knew all of this. All that I'm telling you about, I never knew. And then when I went to by the time I got to university, I learned a bit, but I didn't learn as much as there is now. And so what I see happening as well is that this actually hasn't filtered down into the elementary schools yet. It still seems stuck at post-secondary. A lot of times there are some units applied here and there about but it's usually on reserve schools or schools that have a high native population where some of this is getting taught, but it isn't standardized curriculum per se. And then I just saw in the news that Alberta Education Authority over there in Alberta decided that they were going to remove the residential schools from their curriculum. So again, it's really hard to say that when we hear leaders, politicians talk about reconciliation, and then we get these steps forward, but then we often find we get these different people taking these steps backward as well. And when you don't want to deal with some of these, and you end up, of course, uh, hiding that information again and trying to leave it by the road and not deal with it. So again, comes back to what Badwawadam said of picking up what was left alongside the road. And at that point in time, it was that Native people, the image of Native people were that they were less than, and that they tried to inculcate in us that we were not good enough, and that we were not the ones. And even back then, of course, there was debates about whether we were even people. And of course, if you're not a people, I mean, you can't own land. So that was the purpose of that debate as well, was whether or not to, if they recognize us as people, then it's harder to take away our land. So, but on the one hand, there were people like the Aborigines Protection Society, who did act as a conscience with their non-native brothers as well. So it wasn't all non-native people are all bad, isn't what I'm trying to say either.
no,
It's just that these structural mechanisms that are in place, these power structures that perpetually uh, disempower native people, and then also serve to actually uh, hide these truths and these ways of knowing, as well as trying to get more people to understand it and to actually act honorably upon it, and then to walk hand in hand together, like what that wampum belt behind you shows.
so just to finish up that question, when I think about like Matthew Kuncom and John Burroughs and the different ones that are calling on these old things that took place that caused us to have a leg to stand on in our own land, do you feel that these agreements have effect in the law today? And does the Royal Proclamation of 1763 still have a role in determining our modern land claims today?
The simple answer is just yes. They'll always point to that Royal Proclamation, But Sarah referred earlier on to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they actually recommended that they do away with the doctrine of discovery, which that royal proclamation is based upon. And so if they were able to do away with that, then we'll see where we actually get in regard to resource sharing and the distribution of wealth and power. I always like when I was just got out of my my undergrad. I worked with the Assembly of First Nations on an epidemiological study on the contaminants in fish and wild game. And one of the fellows that was the lead scientist was a Seneca named Henry Lickers. And he worked for the Mohawks of Akwesasne and in their environment division. And what he often said was we've been researched to death, but the principles, he says, if you want to come and do research with us, he says, I call it the 3 E's, or the zeal to deal. And he says that it should be, the 3 E's are equity, empowerment, and equality. He says, equality is having an equal say at the table. And empowerment is, are you teaching us the science or whatever, the knowledge, passing on the knowledge so that we will be able to take that over. And then equity is, are you actually properly funding us to engage in this work, or are you setting us up for failure? So I always look at like that, and I still use that because it's simple, that 3 E's, and that's Henry Lickers with the equity, equality, and empowerment. And now I see we have bigger elaborations on these. But one of the things, if you actually, I went out to BC a couple of years ago, and then I was at Victoria, and I went to the Royal Museum, British Columbia Museum in Victoria, and they had an exhibit there, and they showed, I was just astounded because they showed the modern Nisga'a Treaty. They had a picture of it. And have you ever seen it?
No, I don't think I have.
When I was a kid, my mom bought the Encyclopedia Britannica set for us. And that treaty is bigger, has more volumes than that.
Wow.
And so if you think of the modern treaty compared to these one-pagers, where like what Sarah had mentioned, where you seed, yield, and relinquish, and surrender, all that can be done in one page. But to actually turn around and share some of that back, you take a whole bookshelf to do so. So it's a further complication. Things get, I find anyway, it was easy enough to take it away, but the amount of obstacles that are put in place to actually give a meager amount of it back is staggering. And you just point to that Nisga'a Treaty and compare it to that Treaty 9.
That's really just drives you crazy thinking about that, doesn't it? The effort that has to be put in order to get back a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I know I just hear about what's happening in Six Nations, and they've only got 5% of what the treaty that they stood on, or the promises that they stood on. They only have 5% left, and they're standing up for it, and they're being, looked at as renegades and terrible people because they're standing up for their final 5%. It's like the Alamo,
Yeah.
when you think about it.
And of course, the same with Mi'kma'ki people right now, and the amount of lobsters that they're actually taking in comparison to the amount of lobsters that the commercial fishermen are taking is just meager, and it's just like the amount to give something back, especially something that's won in the Supreme Court of Canada, and you see that Canada, the government and the Prime Minister, largely silent on that. And even if they are saying words, they're not backing that up again for the safety of those fishermen that are trying to earn their livelihood out there. So I just see that uh, it's very disappointing and dismaying, because I know, basically I know that would go on anywhere in Canada and the United States. If any kind of issue like that came up where Native people were to get back a share, there's going to be a bigger pushback against it.
Yeah.
And it's sad to say, but and I just believe that that's what would happen. So the only thing that we can really do is just to keep continuing to try and educate people, and then to find the people that are really looking to right those injustices and to right those wrongs, and by actually relinquishing their hold on some of that. That's the hard part. That they're all right with voting for the concept, but when it actually comes down to relinquishing it, that's when things start to get ugly.
There are so many non-native people now that are seeing the things that we're bringing up and recognizing the truth and the honor and the dignity that comes from, honoring those past things.
Yeah.
So, consider that even this conference that we're having online is a result of non-native people who said, we got to do what's right. We got to let people know the truth. And so we're on here because, lots of people want to help. And so I can just say that there's a lot of positive stuff that's happening, and you're bringing a lot of clarity to it.
Oh no, I realize that we have a lot of allies too, and one of the one I was asked to go and talk at a QP gathering last year actually, and what I mentioned to them, that to the union members there, because they were asking about also asking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how they can actually participate. But I just said, when I was younger and I lived in Toronto, I said, I know that when I worked at the Chiefs of Ontario, whenever we marched on Parliament Hill, or I should say the Ontario government, Queen's Park, whenever we marched to Queen's Park, we could usually count on the unions to come and help. And I don't know how many different times we marched, and the unions would march in solidarity. So I know that there are a lot of people that are allies, and that they really do put their best foot forward, and they actually are more about action rather than talk.
I'm so thankful for them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's standing together is, of course, where the strength is.
I was just looking at the time here. I think it would be a nice space to bring in some questions from the audience. I did bring one up here. This one's from Justine Foxall. She says, if I heard correctly, Molly helped her husband to understand the ways of the various nations. Was this also a linguistic understanding? And this leads me to ask about the way women, A, contributed to the treaty discussion, and B, the passing on of language. Are you aware of women practicing literacy, that is writing in early times?
I am unaware. I am unaware of literacy in Mohawk at that time period. I know that later on Joseph Brant was educated, and that he could write in English. And then, but I don't know at that point in time if Molly Brant was. But we do know that she was a very influential woman, and that she had a lot of power, and that Haudenosaunee society attributed and accorded women a lot of their rightful power and the ability to dehorn, I shouldn't say dethrone, dehorn their chiefs.
Yeah.
And so she was able to, in a sense, advise Sir William Johnson on the proper way to do diplomatic relations. So I don't believe, but I'm not an expert on Molly Brant, but I don't believe that she could read and write in English, and that she transmitted that or read and write in Mohawk at that time. I'm not even certain when the Mohawks or others embraced their literacy devised on the English language alphabet. I should say the alphabet, because the Jesuits for sure were already writing Mohawk words back in the 16th century, and they had word lists and dictionaries and all this, but that was kind of incipient literacy at that point, and it didn't really flourish in Indian country till later on. And incidentally, I did find in my quest to find Ojibwe authored and Ojibwe documents written in Ojibwe or Anishinaabemowin, I have come across many documents that appeared to me anyway written in Mohawk, but whether or not they're Cayuga or Onondaga or Mohawk, I can't tell. But I know they're not Anishinaabe, and I know they're not Cree, and I know they're. And then looking at the bottom where the name is, I know that it's a Haudenosaunee name that's still current. Let's say like Loring or Hill, any of the or Miracle or any of these other kinds of names. So I know that it's a Haudenosaunee name, but the document is written all in Mohawk, likely Mohawk. I suspect Mohawk, but could be Onondaga, Cayuga, or Oneida or Seneca.
So there's a question up here, and I know we don't have much, we've got very little time left, but this is really interesting to talk with you. Somebody posed a question here that I think I'd like to ask, but they're like, I guess you're going to have to give your short version, but this is the biggest question you're probably going to be asked tonight. And Kim asked us, shouldn't the Indian Act be abolished?
Yeah, of course it should be. But the other thing is, you really just can't pull it right out. You have to actually have something ready for in its place. What's going to take its place? Because sometimes there are some protective elements in it as well. But it should, of course, be taken abolished, and then even when the funny thing is, even when some of the more archaic parts are taken, then it just more or less gets how would you say that? Not refined, but I'm thinking of membership or status, and how now when Jeanette Corbiere Laval and other women fought for their status for their children, then they became called C-31, and that's part of the Indian Act. And now I'm not exactly sure what they call. They have other designations. So although she won that right, that still stays in the Indian Act, and then also they recognize that it's unconstitutional based on gender, but they turn around and they still have a law in there where basically you're able to erase recognized people of their nation who get labeled Indians under that law. So it's still in force. So you really do have to get rid of it, but you got to actually put something in place.
Yeah.
And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't.
I know.
or profess
I
to be.
know, and I can remember there was a time not all that long ago when there was a Minister of Indian Affairs who was all set to strike the Indian Act and start a new thing, and it couldn't happen, I guess, because there was too many people that just stood up against it at the time because the shift would have been too much for everybody. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was a time of real. I didn't know what to think. Like it sounded good, but it was scary actually.
yeah. So there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of people that want to get rid of not only the Indian Act, but also looking at international law. So people are always in our area talking about the work of Sharon Venn and looking at what she's doing and how she's working with the United Nations and trying to actually build that back, the nation to nation relationship, and that she sees or recognizes and exposes the insidiousness of contribution agreements in Indian country, and looks at how that's detrimental to the overall goal of not only self government but the inherent right to self government and self determination. So these a lot of these uh, contribution agreements, whether they are health or education, social services, often have these clauses in there where, again, they're still holding the money and make compel leadership to sign that. Or sometimes they're not really compelling them because the leadership aren't really aware of the insidious nature of those clauses in there as well. Anyway, that's the kind of work that people are looking at, and they want to actually get that those kind of clauses removed from those contribution agreements, so that they actually do recognize the nation-to-nation relationship without actually putting in these extinguishment clauses in there in those agreements.
Right. Right. So there is a pathway to do it. There's a visual pathway, but it's going to take some effort.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sarah?
No, I was going to, there's one here from Anna. Anna is born from Blackfoot, Piikani territory, but born on Mi'kma'ki, sorry if that's wrong, land. Is there a difference between the stories and words shared by men, women, and clans?
It depends. Um, where I'm from and the teachers I had, there was per se, the majority was, there was no, like, if you had a storyteller, the storyteller told the story to boys and girls, men and women, whoever was in the crowd. And so these are, I'm talking about these Adzokanak, Ansokanan, and that old man that I used to talk about, that I was talking about, he actually said that that Nanabush was also Wisakijok and Nape. And these are, he says that's the same man. And so some would say also he's Gluskap. So it's the same fella who went through our territory. And then, but what that old man had said was, but Nanabush came to the Anishinaabe twice and blessed us twice by his presence. Anyway, so to me, from what I understand, the majority of it is both um, available to all. However, when a young woman has her first menses and is becoming a woman, then that's when a specific time when the older woman would instruct her, and then also same thing with men. When the men had young men voices changed, then the old men would go and advise and counsel that young man. So whether or not I know that old man actually knew what the old ladies would tell the young ladies, and actually he would be asked that. So it's a bit more. It sounds like it's an easy answer, but there's of course different factors and situations that where it isn't as clear cut. The other last example, I was talking to these ladies from Sagamuk, and they're talking about these medicines that they learned from their mother, but their mother learned from their grandmother. And one was a specific type of medicine that's quite popular, but she had said that it was a lady's medicine, a woman's medicine. And she said, but this one man says, it doesn't matter who makes it, if it's a man or a woman. And so he went and tried to make that medicine, and it didn't turn out. So she was saying that that's what they already knew. And of course, he had to try and prove them wrong, but he proved them right.
So, Sarah, I think perhaps you maybe want to just give Alan our thank yous and reminders and. You're not.
I was muted. Ugh. No, I just wanted to say bless you for being willing to take part in our conference in this virtual format. Thank you so much. Yeah, we look forward to hoping that you pop in on our next presentations, and love to see how in the future you build upon your work. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, it looks like an interesting lineup. I know John Burroughs personally, and of course, I've learned a lot from his work and his books, and also talking to him from time to time. You'll learn a lot from him as well.
For sure. I also want to say thank you for everybody who joined us tonight. And definitely tune in again on Tuesday, November 3rd. Our guest presenter will be Canada's former Grand Chief, Dr. Matthew Kuncombe. He spent his working lifetime building Canada's first modern treaty. He ran a real-life experiment, and the results confirm the workability of the principles that we have just heard of. They confirm the excellence of the ancient pathways that Professor Corbiere has described. So join us again next Tuesday night, election night, so it'll be a big night in many ways. And I'm just going to ask Jonathan that if you could bring our evening together to a close now.
Alan, I want to say thank you personally. I really appreciate the effort that in your life that you've given to be able to bring us such concise history. And I feel enlightened tonight. I feel like I've learned, and it just makes me want to grow more and be a part of the front line that brings the change that our next generations are gonna have to have. I'd like to sing a song for you guys called The Sacred Fire. Look upon your people and breathe on us new life. Keep the fire burning and burn away our strife. Burn away our strife. Let love take all the shame, the anger, the fear, and the pain, and draw Let your spirit start the sacred fire of the heart. Let it burn within our soul. Oh, come, let us arise. Bring us to new heights. Let the fire that you gave to the people that burned so long ago, let it be restored with honor. Let it burn once again in our soul. Let it burn once again in our soul. Let the children see their fathers as men of dignity, who walk with respect and honor, and with a heart that is free. Oh yes, with a heart that is free. The sacred fire of the heart, let it burn within our soul. Oh, come, let us arise. Bring us to new heights. The sacred fire of the heart, let it burn within our soul. Let it burn within our soul. Let it burn within our soul. Oh, come, let us all arise and bring us to new heights. Oh, come, let us all arise and bring us to new heights. The sacred fire of the heart, let it burn within our soul. Let it burn within our soul. Let it burn within our soul. So, Creator, we come to you tonight with thanks in our heart, with hope for the promise that things are going to change. We have hope for a change for our people. Lord, even today we see, Creator, we see the issues that we face, but we have people that are rising up that have wisdom. We have people that are rising up that have passion. We have allies that are rising up that are joining us, giving us a voice to be able to see peace and to see us walk together in a good way across this land. I believe that Canada was meant to be a place of peace and a place of leadership. I believe that as Canada mends its relationship with its First Peoples, I believe it will begin to establish a banner in the whole world of recognition, of honor and respect of the Indigenous people of the lands around the earth. So I thank you tonight. I say Niawagowa tonight for the good words that have been spoken and the sincerity and the passion. I thank you for Sarah and Alan and the team that has presented. And just pray that you would bring us back here next week. Creator, that you would come and that your spirit would be with us and bring us the peace and the hope and the changes that we need to see our people be people of self-respect, to be able to walk in dignity, and to be able to see love bind this nation together as we walk the path together. I pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.